People who are pretty sure they've encountered a serial killer. What happened? U/shot_construction 455 responded. I had an employee that worked for me doing minor maintenance repairs on construction equipment. One day it just took him way too long on a job and I was pissed. I pulled the GPS info and he was nowhere near where he was supposed to be. My admin and I both called him repeatedly with no response. Now I'm even more pissed because this wasn't the first time he took too long, didn't answer his company provided Nextel radio. We start digging. Find out it has happened repeatedly. He gets back late and I waited for him, alone, in my office. I terminated him and he took it surprisingly well. Surprised me because I dealt with a ton of BS as a woman working in a male-dominated field and company. Few years later, I'm working in a different location for the same company and some cops show up and want to know what I remember about him. I tell them I fired him, etc. They subpoena the GPS records from the company. Then they started finding the rest of the bodies. He pled down and pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was picking up prostitutes in the company work truck, killing them and dumping bodies in a rural part of the neighboring county. U/Monroe responded. Robert Lee Yates was an Army pilot flying OH-58s while I was flying UH-1s, same battalion but different company, at Fort Drum, New York. They would send us down to fly helicopter simulators once a year in Pennsylvania to maintain our instrument ratings. We would carpool in one vehicle. Bob had a van with shag carpet in the back, so he would drive about 5 of us during those trips. It was about a 4-hour drive, so we'd joke and tell stories to pass the time. I was a fairly new pilot who enjoyed hearing the veteran pilots tell war stories. Bob was a CW3 at that time and was a bit odd but nothing alarming. 18 years later we see him on TV being charged with multiple killings of prostitutes across several states. He had used a Corvette and a van for the killings. Yes, that same van. U/balance acrobatic 577 responded. My grandmother swears she met David Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer. My grandfather was stationed in Fort Bliss, so she took her 3 daughters camping in Elephant Butte State Park, the same place where he was a ranger. She said a ranger kept trying to get them to stay in his trailer instead of camping by the lake. Obviously they refused and went on a hike, but when they came back their campsite was trashed, so she packed them all up and drove home in the dark. When I got into true crime and was telling her how close he was to us, she relayed the story, and when I showed her a photo she said that it was definitely him, just aged a bit. Not his usual MO, but this would have been in the mid-70s and no one's exactly sure how long he killed for. * edited changed national park to state park. U/Mombach responded. We were having a family barbecue at my cousin's farm in the late 70s early 80s, when my 12-year-old cousin decided to ride his bike to the store. Just after leaving, a van pulled over to him and the driver tried talking him into the vehicle. When that didn't work, the man got out and tried to force him into the van. My cousin kicked and screamed and refused in every way possible to get away. A passing car saw what was happening and stopped, which probably spooked the van driver. The guy got back into his van and drove away immediately. My uncle, who was a member of the RCMP, had heard the commotion, had jumped into his car and drove to see what was going on. He managed to catch up to the van and arrested the guy for attempted kidnapping. Unfortunately, the charge didn't stick and the guy was eventually let go. The man's name was Clifford Robert Olson. We're pretty sure that my cousin might have been one of Olson's first attempts. U/Fine Mechanics responded. This is a definitely encountered a serial killer rather than pretty sure. I grew up in a small town in North Wales, UK. The local cinema had been closed for 15 years, but a guy from out of town had reopened it. As kids, this blew our minds, as it was a rural area, with very little to offer in terms of entertainment, so it seemed unbelievable to us that we would actually have a cinema in town. On one visit to the cinema, I ended up needing to use the toilet during a film, so left the theater, walked through the foyer and into the toilet. There was no toilet paper, so I went back into the foyer and spoke to the cinema owner to ask if he had any toilet paper. I was younger than 10 at the time and very nervous about speaking to adults, but the owner was incredibly kind and friendly, gave me the toilet paper, and we had a conversation about the film and how happy I was that we now had a cinema in the town. I used the toilet, then went back into the theater. A few weeks later the friendly cinema man was on the front page of every newspaper. He was Peter Moore. U/Jaketsoon 91 responded. I was in jail in Summit County in Ohio for being an idiot, basically, and came across the man that would be known as the Craigslist killer. The guy held Bible studies every night, was super preachy, and was very persuasive with people. He was in jail for a parole violation, running a prostitution mainly IIRC, from a robbery case in Texas and was waiting to see if he would be extradited to Texas. Somehow Summit County messed up and released him even though Texas sent them the paperwork saying they wanted him. He and the kid he had been partnering with had already killed multiple people, and when he was released they failed to kill another person and were caught. Saw his face in the paper about a month later and was like, holy shit, I was in jail with that guy Amau. Phil Collins Ghost responded. I don't know if serial killer but definitely trafficker or child predator. Some background. My stepdad was a truck driver, so often we would visit him at a local truck stop when he was near to grab breakfast, etc. My mother is not great. During one of these adventures my mom decided she wanted us to stay with stepdad in the truck. Sister was 11, I was 9. During this 2-week period, LOL, we were in a random truck stop in the Georgia. My sister and I went to go take a shower, because we hadn't for days, and shared a shower to save on money. I was in and out and waited in the hallways for my sister. A man came up to me and started asking questions. This happened in the early 2000s, so I had been taught stranger danger, but also was still being taught always be respectful to adults bullshit. I was giving him basic answers. But then he pushed showing me his truck. My tiny self was terrified, but I kept saying no, I can't. Eventually he got annoyed and just grabbed my arm and started pulling. In that moment my sister came out and snatched my ass back and we ran. Crying, telling my mom, I'm called over dramatic. If my sister didn't see me, I'm positive I would have never been seen again. Extra alligator responded. Traveling out of state for a vacation with my kids at a gas station, this man starts trying to talk to my young daughter. I immediately got between them, but not before my daughter blurted out exactly where we were going and how long we would be there. I suddenly felt sick. Something about the guy scared me. I just knew there was going to be a problem. I hustled the kids back to the car and waited to drive away out of fear he might follow us. I didn't see him come out, so eventually I drove off, but I was paranoid about it afterward. 2 days later I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone banging aggressively on our door. He was screaming that he was with security for the complex and that there was an intruder seen in the area, so I was required by law to open the door. Obviously I didn't fall for that. He started swearing and threatening me. Suddenly he just stopped. Suddenly something spooked him and he turned and bolted. He had been standing kind of off to the side and reaching over to bang on the door in a way I couldn't see his face. When he moved, I saw it. It was the guy from the gas station. He followed us through 2 states. The actual security for the complex drove around but never found him. There was a broken gate next to the condo that they said he got in through. Haskell hysteric monad responded. Not a serial killer, but he killed more than half of a whole family. Paid him to remove a problematic tree that I wasn't confident about cutting down without dropping it on my home. He convinced me to save the tree and just remove a few limbs that were dangers. He just seemed like a dude. A month later he murdered everyone in a house except a young girl whom he abducted. He stuffed the bodies of the mother's friend's son into the hollow of a tree. When his home was later searched, it was full of piles of leaves and wallpapered to look like trees, and the abducted girl was locked in the basement. Ohio. Edit. Fixed gender of one of the deceased, fixed nominative attributes. U/JM Dubs 85 responded. Few years ago my mother took my son, who was about 6 at the time, to get Santa photos done. Few months later Toronto police arrested him. He had murdered several men. He ran a landscaping company and was hiding the bodies in the ground and planting potters of jobs he was doing. And also working as a mall Santa. Thing that's messed up to me is, I'm aware of his actions. But somewhere, a family has a photo of their child on his lap, completely unaware, full-fledged serial killer on display. Edit. For context, I found the photo. U/MVSR 990 responded. My grandparents took me on a road trip and stopped in Shreveport to gamble. I sat on a bench and read for hours. Sounds shitty, but my attention span wasn't completely fried at that point, and I was happy to read as long as anyone would let me. Another kid a couple of years younger was in the same situation, but he was not a reader. We start talking and eventually he starts telling me about the neighborhood animals he's tortured and killed. Cats, dogs, wild animals. He was an equal opportunity monster. Might have just been trying to impress a stranger, might currently have a crawl space packed with bodies, who knows? U/miss my best friend 123 responded. Not exactly a serial killer, but when I was about 7, my sister and I became convinced our neighbor was a serial killer because he was coming and going all hours of the night and constantly had his bathroom light on. My bedroom window had a view of the side of his house, so we wrote all our evidence on my window with expo markers. A few weeks after our investigation began, my dad was out front mowing the lawn early in the morning when the neighbor came out and asked him for a cigarette. My dad said he didn't have one, so the neighbor kept walking. A little while later we heard sirens. There was a man who always walked his little wiener dog around the neighborhood, kind of a local celebrity. He was walking around the apartment complex 2 houses down from us when the neighbor saw him and stabbed him to death. The guy never gave a motive aside from mental illness, but my dad's theory is that the neighbor really wanted a cigarette and we all knew Wiener Dog Guy smoked, so if Wiener Dog Guy said no, that might have caused him to snap. He was arrested, but I believe he's getting out soon. So while he is a killer, whether or not he's a serial killer is TBD, I guess. U/JC Jayhawk responded. I was a brand new parent and trying to be a good husband by getting up with my daughter when she cried at night. I remember rubbing the sleep out of my eyes as I looked at the clock and noting that it was around 3:30 a.m. I laid down on the couch with her on my chest as she slowly quieted down and drifted back off to baby sleep. I always leave my porch light on as a security measure, and this night was no different. I was just about to take my daughter back to her crib when I heard a knock at the door. I tried to ignore it, but 2 more knocks came in succession with a plea for help. I took my daughter back to my wife and shut their door. She was kind of pissed until I explained what was going on. Through the window I saw a relic from the 1970s. A white dude fro accompanied by some wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a nasty t-shirt and dirty jeans. He knocked again and gave another plea for help. There was no car around, so he obviously arrived on foot. I finally asked him what he needed, through the locked door, and he responded that he was injured and needed medical attention. I knew that was a lie. I lived a half block from the town hospital. You can literally see it from the porch. Just let me come in and use the phone, he insisted as he tried the door handle. I told him I'd do him one better. I would call the police for him. I did so, and as I was calling he bolted. U/Georgerini responded. I met the murderer of Grace Mill Lane, not a serial killer, but on the day he was figuring out how to hide the body. So the night after he killed her he came into the block of shops I was working at and was looking for a suitcase. He stopped by my store and asked and didn't buy them, so went the warehouse next to me. That week I got stopped numerous times going home as the police were looking for a shovel. Coming to find out the shovel was across our store at the car wash as he left it there. I even talked to the employee and was wondering why there was a muddy shovel left in one of his slots. You can see on videos him taking the suitcase in the elevator, which was bought in the store next to mine. The fact that he looked normal, acted normal, and bought all these things still spooks me. You would never know. Poor girl. U/Immigration Journey 2 responded. When I was 13 years old, several young girls were raped and one murdered in my city. We were told to be very careful. They also gave us a very vague description of the murderer. The very significant traits they knew of were that he had a darker complexion and 2 pale scars on his face, on each side of his eyes. One day after school I took the subway to go to the place where my mother used to work. It's in the edges of the city, it's not a busy area, so the subway was not crowded at all. I was sitting waiting for my stop when I noticed a guy sitting 10 meters from me. He was wearing a hoodie, but I could still see part of his face, and one of the things I noticed were 2 pale scars similar to what they described. He also had a darker complexion. As soon as I saw that, I immediately stopped looking and I got off at the next stop, trying to look as calm as possible. It was scary, especially because I was close to the type of his victims. U/Yellowbug 2001 responded. I 100% encountered a serial killer almost daily on my way to work. For about 2 years we worked on the same street. I always smiled and waved at him and he seemed perfectly nice. Meanwhile, turns out he'd raped a bunch of women and murdered at least 3 of them. After one girl disappeared and her body was found a couple of months later, the whole town was on high alert for whoever this murderer was, and here I was cluelessly whassaping him regularly pretty much right up until he was arrested. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence in my gut instincts, although to be fair, a lot of people who knew him a lot better than I did also had absolutely no suspicions about him. Apparently there was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde thing going on there. U/Gentle Spirit 23456 responded. Okay. One time it was driving home from the bar late one night. This car was behind, flashing his brights on and off. I pulled up to my driveway and he stopped behind me. He said he was a peace officer and showed his badge. He said he needed me to follow him home because he told his wife he was out with a friend and wanted to show his wife his friend so she didn't think he was lying. I immediately said no, and he was so persistent. Mind you, this was at 3 a.m. I asked, "What the fuck were you doing that you lied to your wife and followed a complete stranger home?" Said no again and went inside my home. I still think about that night. What a fucking creep. You/Sherry-Michael responded. Not a killer, but a rapist. While coming out of the grocery store, my husband and 2 kids were parked right in front waiting on me. I was standing at back of truck, none of them saw this, and a guy approached me commenting on my sandals that he liked them. Then he went on about my long blonde hair as he was a hairdresser and such. I was polite with him till he asked if he could snip a lock of hair at his van. Then I was like, WTF, get away from me you idiot. Walked to my driver's door, opened it, and proceeded to tell my husband of weird guy. By the time I turned around to point him out, this guy had vanished. Our friend was a cop, so that night we mentioned it to him as it was just weird. 2 days later he gets back to us that this guy, based on my story and description, used the exact lines to other women and had by now raped and beaten 3 maybe 4 women. This was all in the Gainesville, Cumming areas of Georgia. I was at the Kroger's in Dawsonville, right next to these areas. What was so scary after finding that out was how quickly he came up to me and then disappeared, and my husband and 2 kids didn't even see me talking to him behind the truck from the window. If I didn't have the same stories he told other women and his description that matched other women's, I would have thought I had made it up. It was that freaky. You/Angel Rain responded. Not me but my grandmother. This was in Florida. She told me about how this man came up to her way back in the day saying he was injured and needed help. He was wearing a bright yellow shirt. Not related, but I remember her pointing that out. She told him that she was really sorry but she was in a rush to go because she was going to meet her sister to make plans for an upcoming family gathering they had planned, so she couldn't be of assistance, and pointed him in the direction of the nearest doctor's office. And just like that, she left. It was Ted Bundy. She said the look in his eye was the most sinister thing she'd ever seen and that she almost helped him, but decided against it last minute. My grandmother was an amazing woman. She was always helping people and saw the good in everyone. But she said he just had an evil look in his eye that she couldn't ignore. You/Asking Alisana responded. Not a serial killer but became part of a well-known missing person case in my state. Used to work with him and he wasn't there long, but he just had this dead look in his eyes and was just always in a I don't give a fuck attitude. He butted heads with my wife, who was a supervisor there at the time, and at one point he went up to her and tried to be this tough stone cold asshole to scare her. It got me, just never wanted them to close together when I couldn't be there because I was scared for her. He eventually got fired, and then a handful of years later we see he was the killer to the missing person and ended up having a shootout with the cops and dying a full state away. You/Cosmatic responded. My wife, then fiancé, and I were out in Brooklyn one night, reasonably drunk, and hailed a cab to go home. The moment I sat inside, something felt wrong. The car seemed more bare bones than a usual taxi, and the driver had a strange effect. There was also a slightly bad smell. The driver was kind of muttering under his breath and making these quiet burps. Every alarm inside of me starting going off. I wasn't consciously analyzing it, it just knew it wasn't safe. The guy starts driving maybe 10 feet, and when I stop him, saying oh shit, I left my bag in the bar, I grab my wife and pulled her out of the cab. The driver starts swearing and gets unreasonably pissed. Instead of waiting 1 minute for us to return as a normal driver might, he immediately speeds off down the street. To this day I'm convinced he was a serial killer, or something similar, and that we narrowly avoided disappearing forever into the night. You/Tired Reader 87 responded. My sibling has special needs, and requires help with almost everything to do with day-to-day living. Thus, we had upwards of 5 PSWs in per day for them, not to mention upwards of 2 others for my mom, Cancer, and Nana. We met a PSW, who worked for the company that came in on weekends to get my sibling out of bed, shower her and feed her breakfast. This was at a friend's birthday party. His also special needs. This woman was like family with them. She eventually started coming to our house on an occasional basis. I wasn't a fan, because she was very loud early in the morning and it annoyed me. She's now in jail, because she killed her disabled roommate. She dumped the body 30 minutes away, in a wooded area. She's a senior, too. It's weird to think about. You/Documenting Kate responded. I was at a shopping mall in Los Angeles, when a man approached me saying he was a casting agent photographer. Immediately knew something was off with the guy, because that's the #1 scam in the book, but he just gave off such vibes that I instinctively knew he was very dangerous. I politely took his card and made a mad dash to the H&M and hid in the dressing stalls. I alerted a staff member and they had security walk me to the car. The gift of fear is real, and trust it. About 2 months later I had the news on in the background and I saw his face. He had been arrested for abducting and murdering a girl from Michigan. He approached her the same way he did me. Scariest thing ever. I believe there's a new Dateline podcast series out about it. I used to work in true crime television and I can't even listen to the podcast because it freaks me out of how close I was to this guy. As I said above, we have the gift of fear. For a long time, women were taught to be polite and ignore this even if uncomfortable. It's super important to trust your gut, and as MFM says, F politeness. You/deleted responded. This was around 2008. We were traveling and living in our van at the time, on the way to see some family. He showed up solo on a motorcycle after sundown to our campsite at a state park in Oklahoma. We were the only campers in the park. He asked if he could piggyback off of our camp permit since they allowed up to 2 vehicles per campsite. Said he was on his way to see his old lady and suspected that she had been cheating while he was off on his travels. He had a real eerie vibe about him. We were hesitant but agreed. We had just finished making some lentil soup and invited him into our camper van for a bowl. He was very grateful as it was pretty cold out. Our dog growled at him the whole time he was in our presence. After he ate the bread and soup, he set up his tent, and we all called it a night. His name was Steve. We called him Cycle Steve later on as we reflected on the encounter. After having been out for several months in the van and only showering at state parks once every few days, we decided to spring for a motel room. While laying in bed flipping through the channels, I saw his face on the local news. I think we were in Kansas at the time. He did catch up with his old lady and murdered her, her lover, and her whole family, whose house she was staying at, and a couple of neighbors who tried to check on the screams they heard. Something like 7 or 9 people total. You/LV463 responded. I was a prison officer for a good few years. For about 3 of those years I was the single point of contact for Dennis Nilsen. It always amazed me how educated he was, yet he'd chosen to murder upwards of a dozen men with not the tiniest remorse to ever be seen. He was very open about his offending and would speak about it the same way a normal person would talk about washing a car. Completely void of emotion. By his own admission, had he not been caught he would have continued murdering. There were a number of serial killers in the prison. Almost all of them were entirely unremarkable, and that, for me, was the frightening thing. David Tennant played him in a 3-part show in the UK. Had I not known that Nilsen had been dead, he could have fooled me along with those I used to work with that he was in fact Nilsen. You/HSketch responded. Not 100% sure they count as serial killers. I think the confirmed body count was 2, but when I was in university, my GF was in a dorm lounge with a few friends one evening when a proto-Debro named Ken came in and whipped out his dorm, allegedly on a dare. My GF and the others knew him by reputation as a local dumbass frat boy wannabe and filed a complaint, which got him a meeting with campus housing to kick him out of the dorms. He showed up to my GF's work on campus to try to intimidate her leading up to the hearing, but she basically laughed off the attempt, and nothing came of it. A little while later, one of my GF's friends was working the front desk when a lady with a Cruella de Vil look and demeanor came into the dorm, asking about the people who got her angel son in trouble by obviously lying, and where she could find my GF and her friends. When the front desk called her to give her a heads up that this lady was looking for her, my GF holed up in her room freaked out a little, then called me over to do some recon so we'd know what this lady looks like. And that's how I came face to face with Santi Kimes, who along with her darling dawn-flashing son Ken, killed a New York socialite for her apartment and at least one other. A couple more disappearances are on their records, as well as arson, forgery, and frigging slavery. You/Mr. Lindemann responded. I'm almost positive I met the Craigslist killer, Philip Markoff, at Foxwoods back in like 2008. My dad, best friend at the time, and I used to go semi-frequently to play poker there back when it was big. We were all at different tables, and when I got up to pee I went to check on my buddy. My friend actually looks vaguely like Markoff, especially from behind. So I approach who I thought was my friend from behind and ask how he's doing, and this guy turns around with the most vacant eyes LVE ever seen but talks to me like he knows me. It was so unsettling. Later on I saw the same guy outside standing with the smokers not smoking when I went out to check on my dad who was smoking. Later on my dad mentioned how weird he was when he was out there. My dad was a social worker for 25 years in the crisis unit and said there was something clearly off with him. A few months later we see him on the news and were both convinced that was the guy we saw at Foxwoods. You/Chupit responded. In 2003 I had an encounter with a confirmed serial killer. He was living in Fargo, North Dakota at the time, and my GF had just moved into a new apt building. A few days after moving in, she's getting creeper vibes from a guy who keeps trying to piggyback into the building without a key. I tell her not to worry about it, big mistake. She then finds him on the Fargo sex offender registry site, and I feel like a POS for not taking her concerns seriously. A friend's younger brother's girlfriend lives in the same building and I hear that he's doing the same thing to her, so friend's brother and I decide to confront him. Next time we see the guy we walk up to him, tell him we know who he is and that he better stay away from the building he doesn't live in or he'll end up dumped in the Red River or something along those lines. He says he doesn't want any trouble and no longer pesters the girlfriends. 2 years later, I'm no longer with the GF and living in MPLS. I'm at my parents' house for 4th of July weekend, and the dude's mugshot is all over the nightly news for a kidnapping and triple murder. U/Riptor 1987 responded. I, F38, actually worked with a serial killer for a few years. We got hired together, trained together, and continued to remain work friends. He had come over to my home a few times for parties. He never gave me the out-and-out creeps, but one time he asked me to give him a drive home and I just wasn't comfortable giving him a drive home, so L told him my boyfriend was uncomfortable with me being alone with him. He was actually arrested where we worked together. I remember walking out to the parking lot and seeing the police towing his car. I actually texted him to check in and see if he was okay. I found out the next day that he had been arrested and what he had been arrested for. He's the Arizona Canal Killer, look him up. The thing that bothered me was how so many people who knew him for years and were just as friendly with him as I was, kept saying, I always knew he was weird. He always gave me the creeps. To them I say, no you did not, and no he didn't. The guy in question had always been fairly popular. He was a little weird, but a lot of the people we worked with were weird. Still blows my mind how long I knew someone who killed people. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Leave your own stories down below, I would love to read them. If you would like to see more videos like this, please like and subscribe, it helps me out greatly.